590 AM. Roger.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we can resume this morning's session, that'd be great. I hope you took advantage of that quick break to have a bit of a chat and speak a bit more to Doug. My apologies that we've actually had a slight change to this morning's session. In fact, we don't have a third presentation this morning, which is why we have allowed the break to run a little bit longer so that you could continue with your questions. It also means that we will have a little bit more time for this second panel session. It's my great pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel. Well, actually, I won't introduce the panel, but we do have a very distinguished panel. What I will do is hand over to the panel chair to take you through the panel and to introduce our speakers. I think most of you would already know Mike Simpson. He's the former president of the International Space University. He is still a faculty member there. His current role is as Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation, but some of you may also know that he is a member of our Board of Governors, and we are absolutely delighted for all of the work that Michael Simpson has done in supporting NSS and the Space cause. So on that note, I will introduce Mike and let him run this panel session on space sustainability. Thank you, Mike.
Well, it seems totally appropriate that we get our international sustainability panel started with an introduction from an Australian of an American of Irish descent who actually does hold an Irish passport in order to deal with one of the more interesting topics affecting the way in which our sector is evolving internationally at the current time. Sustainability is a word that has increasingly been applied to a whole range of policies in the space sector. And we wanted to focus a bit today on an important set of the foundations of sustainability. And so we're going to look a lot at the issue of cooperation. That is, what does it take for countries to work together in a way that they advance, they innovate, they do exciting things, they tackle difficult missions, but they also do it in a way where they keep the opportunity for using space fresh, available, and hopefully eventually even uncluttered as we go forward. So you will hear a substantial amount today about the concept of cooperation, and you'll hear it from a panel that has had a great range of experience in the field. And what I'm going to do is really the very brief introduction at this point of each panel member, and then allow them in the normal flow to present their ideas, and then hopefully to open up for some questions. We will lead off today with Lynn Cline. Lynn retired from NASA, who played a very important role in a wide range of international activities, but especially in the area of space station. An icon, one of the most amazing things humankind has ever built, but filled with the challenges of working across many cultures, many nationalities, and sort of many political eras as well to make it work. Following Lynn will be Abiodun. Ade is Nigerian and has had a distinguished international career in space with a special role as the leader of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and will give us a sense a bit of how that organization has evolved and what it's doing to try to nurture international cooperation. Next to Ade is Sarah Factor. Sarah represents the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Space Policy. She's going to give us a sense of the sort of the interaction of space sustainability and security, and the reality that there too there are complex areas of cooperation. She's had a substantial experience dealing with both bilateral and multilateral relationships at the defense level. And next to Sarah, to her left, Philippe Hazane, Philippe, of course, I can't avoid mentioning an ISU alumnus, but represents CNES and will provide us perhaps an interesting insight to the French Space Agency's rather extraordinary role in international cooperation in the host of many missions which have been carried on cooperatively with other countries, but also its extraordinary mission as the responsible party for administering the Guyanese Space Center, Europe's launch site in French Guiana, an area where obviously many substantial missions have begun, but one which itself is a bit of a microcosm for international cooperation. So with that insight to the direction we're going and the way we're sort of tying the threads of what we're doing, I ask Lynn Cline to come to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. I just retired from a over 36-year career at NASA, and I began in NASA's international office and then moved to space operations and exploration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about international cooperation in general, and then lessons learned from space stations specifically. Because of my background, my focus is on how we approach international cooperation from a government perspective, not industry or private activities. So let me start with this. When we do governmental negotiations, it's very different from a contract negotiation. I'm going through a kitchen renovation right now. And so I can do comparison shopping and go around and decide who has the best deal and move on to somebody else. But if you're a government and you're looking at cooperation, there's usually a particular partner that you've identified and agreed to engage with. And there is very, very strong motivation to make it work. You don't say, oh, gee, that didn't work out, I'll go to somebody else, because there may be no other country that has that capability that you're looking for. Since governments are using taxpayers' money for their activities, they have to ensure that there's something in it for them. And so what you want to do in the cooperation is very much based on political, scientific, and technical or economic interests. It's really important as a negotiator to understand the rationale for each partner's participation, what their requirements are, and the expected outcomes. All the partners do not go in with the same interests or expectations, but the cooperation will only succeed if those varied interests are met. And so the compromise is very much required, and that way you can converge on what's best for all of the partnership. Bilateral negotiations are obviously a lot easier because there's two parties. And what I found is that usually you've decided, for example, in Doug McQuiston's Mars presentation, NASA and ESA decided we want to work together on a Mars mission. So the negotiation is not about whether or not we should cooperate on Mars, but it's the details of who's going to do what portion of it, when, how is it going to be managed, who builds what instrument, those kinds of things. And one of the things that I found throughout my career is that precedents, good and bad, very much affect those attempts to build new projects. So what I call baggage comes along. So when I was negotiating the agreement for the Cassini mission between NASA and ESA, I think at virtually every negotiating session, I heard about the International Solar Polar Mission, which from the European perspective was viewed as an agreement where NASA had not followed through and met all of its commitments. NASA certainly met many of its commitments, but one of the spacecraft, which we were to provide, was canceled in a budget process. And so the partners were looking for assurances that that would not happen again. In the case of Spacelab, what the U.S. had an expectation that Europe would use Spacelab quite often, and Europe had the same expectations, but the way the agreements were written, Europe built the Spacelab, they had one mission, and then any future missions of Spacelab on the shuttle, they would have to pay for the flight. And so that tended to discourage European interest in using it. And so both sides, interestingly enough, wanted, as we went into space station, something that gave a greater vested interest on Europe's part in an ongoing operation. So when we run into these kinds of problems, there are frequently precedents you can find, and there are lots of examples of these that you can point to help solve those problems. Now, multilateral negotiations clearly are more complex. There are more competing interests. And what I found on Space Station, which is very much a multilateral program, is that there are a lot of negotiations that occur, obviously, across the table in the formal sessions where you're working with the text, but there are just as many negotiations occurring outside of that framework, different coalitions of interests, so I found that the original partners in the space station program, Canada, Europe, and Japan, sort of banded together to make a case for certain things that they wanted from the U.S. or that they wanted the U.S. to get from Russia. If there were elements that were similar, like transportation systems between Europe and Japan, they would get together and see what was the best thing for both of them and then come to the partnership with that. So there are many intricate layers of negotiations that go on to come to an agreement. So I think some of the key things that I have learned in my career through such international discussions are things like, first, you really do need to understand your partner's objectives. There are political ones, economic ones, technical and scientific objectives and capabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, they don't always match, nor do they need to. In fact, some of the strongest collaborations are when they're complementary. Some of the most difficult negotiations, if you have two partners who want to do the same thing. I want to build a habitat. I want to build a propulsion. If everybody wants to build a propulsion, who's going to build the rest of the system? So having complementary objectives can be very helpful. Some space agencies are motivated by the science. Those of you who listened to Doug this morning saw that Mars exploration program is very much driven by the science community and its priorities as they set them. Other countries may be motivated by new technology that they want to develop or industrial capacity that they want to ensure is sustained. There are many different things that may be going on. If you have a long-term partnership, and certainly if you're talking about a human exploration endeavor, it is a long-term activity, things are going to change. The environment will change, but also partners' interests may change. And we have seen this definitely in the International Space Station. What may have motivated countries to join in the beginning changed as political parties changed, elections happened, financial pressures came in, and so on. And this happened in all of the countries. So here are some top-level lessons learned for a long-term human space exploration endeavor like the International Space Station. Adaptability is very important. We started out with an original idea with President Reagan's call for space station freedom, that this was a U.S. leadership initiative, and we wanted international partnerships, but the U.S. was going to go with or without partners. And over time, as the program developed, interdependence increased more and more. The partnership faced political and policy changes. Just look at the change from originally having space station be the U.S. Western coalition, U.S.-led Western coalition against the Soviet Union, change from Soviet Union to Russia, and bringing them into the partnership, and now they're part of the alliance, not the people that we're trying to demonstrate a difference with. So there were political and policy changes, there were financial pressures. I think everybody has financial pressures now, but in the time I was responsible for station, it sort of worked its way around the partnerships. Different countries had problems at different times, and so we'd have to get together and figure out, could we renegotiate some of the terms and conditions to compensate for those. Other things change. When the original agreements were done for space station, there were provisions for future use of different transportation systems by the partners. By the time I came in and negotiated the new agreements to bring Russia into the program, by then Europe and Japan had decided they definitely wanted to have their transportation systems added to the agreements, recognized, and use those to help offset their operations costs. So those things changed. And I think one of the success stories about the space station is that the framework was in fact flexible enough to allow those kinds of changes over time. I think it's important that we have, for a program of that breadth and depth, some robustness, so redundant and complementary capabilities, especially in transportation, turned out to be very important. And the transportation systems have changed over time in this program. From a personal perspective, and I can say this now that I'm retired, I think we should not be in the situation we're in now, where the U.S. does not have an active transportation capability for astronauts to the station. I wish we had a way to keep going with what we had while we develop a new system so you have a smoother transition. But be that as it may, I think it's good that we had, during the Columbia accident, the Russians to rely on. If we didn't have multiple transportation systems, we would be in a much more difficult position. Now, one of the things that the chair of the Space Station Multilateral Coordination Board did some years ago, that's Bill Gerstenmaier, was ask the partners to develop a set of lessons learned. So the partners put together operational lessons about interoperability, communications, lessons about engineering, lessons about management, lessons about many different aspects of space station. We published this in a book, a small document, and it's posted online, has been since it was developed. And we also turned this over to the International Space Exploration Coordination Group, and the perspective that was taken was, you as a space station partner, if you were to advise the next generation that is building a human exploration program on an international basis, what would you tell them you've learned? What should you do? Things like standardization and interoperability and how to deal with the political changes and so on. All of those are in this document referenced here. And so that's what I wanted to share this morning. Thank you.
Ade, you want to move straight to the podium?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Mike, I want to thank you very much for you and your foundation for inviting me to this event. I'm going to speak briefly about two issues. The international aspect we deal mostly with COPUOS, and those of you who are here, I'm sure, being in the space community, you know what COPUOS is. And if you don't, it stands for the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, with emphasis on peaceful uses. And secondly, Mike has asked me to reflect on how the international community is cooperating with Africa and how Africans are cooperating with themselves. So without much ado, let me quickly move on. I look at the word cooperation. Let me see. Yeah. I look at the word cooperation, cooperation. And what do we mean by cooperation, particularly within a regional or an international context? And essentially, it means people have something in common, a shared vision, and because of that shared vision, they need to work together to achieve their objective. In so doing, however, they need to also recognize that they must make some hard political decisions. They must trust one another. They must make sacrifices as well as compromises. And that is what runs most cooperations at the regional and international levels. Now, in the UN, formally, cooperation is achieved through a variety of legal instruments, some of which you already know. The Space Treaty, the Moon Treaty, the Liability Convention, rescue and surrender of astronauts and equipment, and so on and so forth, and also the principles of remote sensing. All of these are many of the legal instruments in the UN. But there are others. The UN only moves in space through conferences. And one of those conferences, or three of those conferences, actually there have been only three of them, NewSpace 68, NewSpace 82, those are the years in 1968, and NewSpace 3, all of them conducted in Vienna, Austria, to define and determine what the international community will do in space, but not what it will do, but how it will do them. Now, when you look at all of this, it has always been difficult. At the end of 1968, all the recommendations that came were passed to the Secretariat. The Secretariat is the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. It used to be in New York until Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General, in cooperation with some other member states, decided to transfer that office to Vienna in October 1993. I didn't like that cooperation, and I protested vehemently, but nobody listened to me. So I had to go there myself, okay? Now, but all the recommendations were always left for the Secretariat to implement. And I remember, I think it was 1988, the delegate from the UK asked me, Ade, how are we making your job difficult? And I said, you want to kill me? You want me to lose my job? To tell delegates how, or to show them their dirty linen? Because that's what I'm going to do. And the chairman, the late Professor Carver of Australia, gave me the floor, and I dodged it. And eventually I had to speak, and I made sure I didn't present anything in writing. So, but I remember telling them that you talk about cooperation in this room all the time. And I come back after about 10, 12 activities in the international community with recommendations of what to do. And all you can tell me and those people who sent you the recommendations is the committee noted. Now, that's no cooperation. And I remember when I said those words, I sweated a little, but I moved on. Now, when we talk about this cooperation, we did that for NewSpace 68, NewSpace 82, And nothing got accomplished very much because every responsibility was left to the Secretariat. And some powerful delegates, or delegations, let me say, insisted that there should be no financial implications for any of the recommendations that were coming out of these conferences. So when we went to NewSpace 3, the Secretariat was wiser and said, okay, delegations will now, member states themselves will now implement whatever they recommend. And that led to the Space Millennium that came out of NewSpace 3 in 1999, and eventually we came up with 14 action teams on so many topics. Now, at the present moment, we've been talking about so many things at COPUOS. But by 2004, when I became chairman, we decided we needed to focus a little bit differently because we're fighting the same issue year in, year out. And when you read the report of the committee for 20 years in a row, since 1959 to today, especially between 59, or let me say between 68 and 2000, you can see some paragraphs that have been repeated for 10 years in a row with no changes. So we invited Carl Deutsch, who was formerly president of ISU and chairman of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of COPUOS, to give us his vision about the future. Please, let me get my water, please. And he did in a lecture. He gave us his insight. I put up a paper called Chairman's Paper, non-paper, and the delegates said, we don't like this non-paper, and I insist. And I had to get up from my seat, point my finger at him, which was not right, but I had to do it. And I said, in this committee, you don't insist on anything, because the committee works only by consensus. We do not vote. So what are the practical ways of getting things done at COPUOS to get the cooperation of member states? I've spoken about the legal tools. But if you're a new delegate to COPUOS, the first lesson you must learn is to keep your mouth shut for 2 years. See how things are done, because you may say the wrong thing. Everybody once in that room operates on the basis of the plaque in front of him or her. That is the sovereignty. And therefore, when you address that person along with the plaque in front by saying, distinguished delegate of the United States, distinguished delegate of France, distinguished delegate of Russia, distinguished delegate of Sierra Leone. You don't say, oh, I call Mr. Abiodun to speak. No, it is not done. And that's how you get cooperation. Second thing is that formally we use working groups. Because let me ask one simple question here. How many of you have been to a UN meeting in this room, please? Oh, very few. I'm sorry to hear that. But I'm happy also, because I remember my first day in 1978 at the first UN meeting, the way they were talking, I asked myself, and the distinguished ambassador of Brazil, I said, how do they get anything done in this committee? Because when you go into a seminar in a university level or in a business level, who speaks next speaks on the issue the last speaker raised. But in the UN, you come to make a point on behalf and in the name of your country, full stop. Although there's an agenda item, yes, you are addressing the agenda item, but from the point of view of your country, not the point of view of the last speaker or the 10 last speakers, no. So, therefore, there's no cooperation at plenary sessions, particularly at the beginning of the meeting. So, over the years, the committee then devised a way of getting cooperation by establishing working groups, where we now speak like university people, and we do direct debate. But then there are other informal ways of getting things done at the UN. What I call, you lobby delegates. You get them to co-sponsor your event, but make sure you get the right delegates, not the, what I call wishy-washy delegates. You get the right delegates who are powerhouses, because you remember there used to be a company in this country called E.F. Houghton. And they say, when E.F. Houghton talks, everybody listens. There are some delegations when they say, Mr. Chairman, my delegation, please. I say, yeah, the chairman responds. And there are some delegations the chairman may not respond. Okay? So you get their support before you raise an issue from the floor, because once you raise an issue from the floor without their previous or advanced knowledge, you may lose it. That's one. Number two, you can have social events. Invite them to dinner, invite them to lunch, whatever, side meetings. But number three is that there is a reality for cooperation. Let's go back to 1959, when the UN established COPUOS. Why? The rest of the world was afraid of what the USSR and the US were going to do in space. Then you have the Liability Convention. Good. We have the Liability Convention, and we have the same problem. So there's a reality. So those are the cooperation. Then now talk about space cooperation in Africa. Many countries have helped Africa do what it has done or is doing, particularly Nigeria, and Kenya, Egypt, South Africa, and many of the French countries. Many African countries participated in the US Apollo mission by helping the US track some of these events. When Landsat started, some countries like Nigeria and Kenya signed data collection agreement with the United States. Astronomy is another aspect, whereas Egypt and South Africa collaborated with the US space missions with their astronomical facilities. In remote sensing, the US, Canada, and Sweden helped establish CREMU in Kenya. The US helped Egypt establish a remote sensing center, and the French government helped the French colonies establish similar centers in their respective countries. Of course, you cannot speak about all of this without talking about the United Nations. Most of what is happening today in Africa originated from the activities of the UN. Unfortunately, and the entities were mostly UN, USA, WMO, and FAO. UNDP that actually has the money, it took it over 4 decades to appreciate the role of space in development. Now, among the Africans themselves, there is arms constellation among those countries that have satellites so that they can operate together. There are RASCOM, which is for satellite communication. One satellite failed and there's a replacement. And we just established the African Leadership Conference on Space Science and Technology. And that is the aim, basically, to enhance inter-African cooperation in the development and application of space technology. Now, but there are also bottlenecks. And here I have some of them listed for you. Low commitment, inactive participation by member states, lack of support by industrialized countries, and competition among African member states themselves. They prefer overseas cooperation instead of intra-African cooperation. External interference by former colonial masters is another problem. And there are so many programs are listed there. African Remote Sensing Program, COPIN, GATT, and NICE that have failed for lack of cooperation by external sources. Then there are the commercial ventures who come to Africa. So now, what is the focus? These are the things I believe African countries should do. Knowledge generation, knowledge development, because you cannot collaborate if you have nothing to share in terms of knowledge. You cannot get any respect internationally without a sound research capability. So, and to back this up, you need an adequate policy. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, I actually don't have charts, which is rare for somebody from the Department of Defense, but I'm going to take it. So firstly, let me just say thanks to the International Space Development Conference and the Secure World Foundation for having me here, and again, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you without briefing charts, which is, I haven't done that in years. It's pretty awesome. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things in my very kind of brief stint up here. I'm going to talk about how the Defense Department views the sustainability of space. I'm going to talk about how we believe that that is a shared responsibility with the rest of our U.S. government, international, commercial partners, as well as partners from interested groups and individuals like yourselves here. So thank you very much for that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of what the Defense Department is doing in this realm, specifically in partnership with some of our international coalition partners and where we're going with that. So let me just start with kind of the bottom line up front, and the bottom line is precisely this, that our U.S. Defense Department does view the sustainability of space as a security issue. In that recognition, we also very much appreciate the fact that ensuring the sustainability of space is not the sole domain of the U.S. Defense Department, but is a shared responsibility that we have to look to in the broader United States government in partnership with our international partners, with our commercial partners, with the academic community, and with interested groups that can help us think through these immensely complex problems. Per the national space policy, the presidential national space policy that President Obama laid out in 2010, the sustainability, stability, free access to, and use of space were all identified as vital national interests. So what we did as the Defense Department is taking presidential direction. We decided that we needed to have an implementing direction to figure out exactly how we would deal with that, how our programs, how our international posture, how our policies would be able to reflect the direction of our Commander-in-Chief. You will also notice that this presidential national space policy rightly looked towards specifically the international and the academic community to help us out in thinking through these projects. You know, I don't get any younger, quite frankly, and I just had a birthday, so hooray for that. But you know, I'm probably the youngest person on the panel. That's probably safe to say at this point. Thankfully, I'm not the youngest person here. There's a lot of awesome and inspirational high schoolers and college kids out there that are great. And bringing that level of innovation into not only the technical fields, but also how we deal and our perspectives with the international community and the academics is tremendously important to this administration and to the Defense Department as well, especially on these strategic and emerging issues. And so what we ended up doing is taking the national space policy and taking the perspectives in there and translating that into a national security space strategy that was the first ever produced by our SecDef and then also signed and developed with our Director of National Intelligence. Again, what it really recognized was that even though the sustainability of space is a security issue, the environment that we're operating in is becoming increasingly congested, contested, and competitive. And if you know space policy wonks, we call this the 3 Cs. And if you know the Department of Defense, we promptly came up with 5 Ps to ensure the 4 S's because alliteration is just something we excel at. So what was really important besides that, and I'll tell you, even as somebody that helped write that document, I'm not sure I have the 5 Ps and the 4 S's down at this point. What was really important from that document is that it provided us strategic guidance that can help us implement the President's policy. And it specifically told us that we needed to seriously look at and value ever increasingly the international partnerships and the capabilities that our international partners bring to the table over their years of experience through things like the ISS, things like working through COPUOS. And I'll tell you, as a defense person who went to COPUOS, I didn't say a darn thing ever, because I let my civil counterparts do that, and rightly so. So understanding how we fit in and how we can bolster the overarching strategic relationship and framework that our government needs to have in these kinds of very complex international institutions is something that the Defense Department is looking at as well. So let me go into just 3 brief examples of how the US DoD is looking to partner with international and commercial and academic thinkers about ensuring the sustainability in space in an appropriate manner. The first is really promoting responsible behavior in space. And you'll see this through the Defense Department in partnership a lot with the Department of State and other academic and think tanks, nonprofit think tanks. Earlier this year, you saw Secretary of State Clinton come out and announce our support for the proposal of an international code of conduct for outer space activities. Quite frankly, just the discourse that you have on being able to define what responsible use of space is, what responsible operations are, how in theory those would develop, how what isn't responsible, what is detrimental to or potentially detrimental to the space environment, how valuable the long-term sustainability of space really is, and having those discussions not only bilaterally with our partners, but also multilaterally in a UN context and multilaterally in regional contexts has been tremendously informative and helpful for the Defense Department, and we believe the rest of the US government. Secondly, we are increasing both the quality and quantity of data that we are sharing with owner-operators on potential collision and collision avoidance, launch avoidance, several other technical kind of fields. A lot of that is being led by United States Strategic Command and their SSA sharing program. From the Defense Department point of view, we also have several other mechanisms that we work with, both bilaterally and multilaterally, that give us a really wide range of how and when and why we should cooperate, how we can leverage the partners' capabilities and fulfill and arrive at mutual interest and benefit for all parties involved. Very similar to the process that was gone through for the ISS, that identifying mutual benefit, but doing it from a Defense Department point of view and then being able to, again, be able to support the strategic objective of the US government and then the broader interest of all of mankind to have a sustainable space domain in the future. And the last example that I'll really give that is probably the most DoD-centric is, quite frankly, this administration has called on all of us to lead by example. And specifically, our President and our Secretary of Defense have called on us to do that. And we will do that not only because it's an order, but also because it's the right thing to do, quite frankly. And to that end, the Defense Department is really looking at how to better synchronize and optimize space resources that we currently have on orbit and are planning for with our international partners. Part of that is developing a construct called the Combined Space Operations, which essentially is just looking to better effectively plan and operationally use the assets that we have to support national decision-making and our national security kind of customers and counterparts. So again, just to wrap up, the sustainability of space is a security issue in the view of the Defense Department. It is not necessarily the pure responsibility for us to be able to ensure. That is just a much broader responsibility than any one government agency and, quite frankly, any one government, and it will take the creativity and innovation and the dedication for you guys to be here on Saturday at like 10 o'clock in the morning, which we also appreciate. So I just really want to thank you guys for showing up. To the young people out there that are starting this, it's been a fascinating week so far. We had the Dragon capsule that was captured, which is awesome and phenomenal, and just terribly impressive stuff that this entire foundation is doing and this community in a whole is doing. And even though we are, one of the hugest, biggest bureaucracies in the world, we are constantly impressed by your innovation and your creativity and pushing us in technical and in policy realms. So thank you for that opportunity.
Hi, good morning. It's yet morning. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Simpson and the International Space Development Conference to invite me to speak here. I'm very proud of it. And to enhance the international cooperation, I'm going to make my presentation in French. So I hope everybody can speak French. Well, I think I'm not going to do that, but my English is so poor and my accent is not good. So please, if you don't understand, just come here after my presentation. I left some view graphs. I try to, not here. Yeah, it's better? Thank you. Okay, so avec plaisir. I'm going to try to speak about cooperation, international cooperation, and my brief will be in three parts. The first one was a very short one for me. What is a true and relevant cooperation toward a success? The second one will be, I will give you two examples of successful or ongoing successful cooperation between France and USA. And the third one will be a European example, because as you know, in Europe, we have no way out from cooperating for space. We have not the critical size for each country. So we do it, it's not very easy to understand how it works, but it works. And I will give you an example, which is the European Spaceport in French Guiana, which I think is well working for a lot of years now. So what's a good and true cooperation? For me, there is at least 3 points. International cooperation must be balanced between the partners, independently of the size of each contributor. This means three things. The first one is the part brought by each partner has to be absolutely necessary to all the other partners for the sake of the international program. The second one is the international program is not and will not become the ownership of any of the partners, nor become the exclusivity of one of the nations. And the third one is each of the participating nation contributes through its own capacities, its own competencies, and its own choices, as Lynn mentioned it before. Small example which is working very well to illustrate this is the International Space Station robotic arm. It's not a big thing compared to the World International Space Station, but it is mandatory for the system to work. It is a Canadian competencies, it's a choice of Canada, and it really, from my point of view, it's a really good way of cooperating. The bad things, for example, just imagine a coffee cup, under cup of the coffee cup, which has been made by one nation, and another nation is just providing the spoon, and the first nation is stirring the coffee with the spoon. This is not a good cooperation from my point of view. Let's go for success cooperation between France, CNES, the French Space Agency, and NASA. The most famous one for me is an historical one, is around altimetry, the scientific cooperation. Since 1986, NASA jointly offered to CNES to embark a payload, an altimeter, which name was Topex Poseidon. And this one really was a good cooperation because the main mission was provided by NASA. France was just providing an altimeter, but very soon, all the teams with a lot of confidence worked together. And after that, the result was JASO-1. JASO-1 was exactly the reverse. France provided the spacecraft and almost everything, and NASA came with the altimeter and some GPS on board, and the same level of cooperation has been maintained. And one of the key of the success was that to operate the mission was really well defined. Every team needs the other team, And the GPL was given the day-to-day satellite operation, and the CNES was in charge of the special operation of the satellite. So it means that when partners need each other, the cooperation is really a success. To go on JSON, JSON 2 is flying now, and JSON 3 is nearly going to be launched, I hope so, very soon. And we are going on building a new cooperation around that idea with NASA on a new program whose name is SVOT mission. It's a new one with using the Ka band radar interferometer. So it's a new technology. The idea here is that the word I will retain is confidence between the teams who are collaborating at the operating point of view. I'm gonna on with another type of cooperation. Sarah told a bit about it. It is the space situational awareness to avoid the to avoid the collision. Today, it's an ongoing cooperation. It's not yet finalized. The DoD proposed as a first step to provide the kind of service to France, which is perfect for the French Space Agency at least, but not enough for our Air Force. And the next step we hope will be the exchange of data on an operational mode of working, and this could lead to a true partnership. And we consider, as I defined what was a relevant partnership, that in that case, France is providing some operational data because we have some hardware on site, which name is the Grave Radar, and we would like to build a real partnership more than just a service. And then, as I promised, I'm going to try to explain you how Europe is working. That's not possible. So just let's go for an example with the Guyana Space Center. So what, the name of it is the European Spaceport. So who does what there? It's a bit complex, but it's working. We have an Ariane launch is the result of a teamwork that brings together skilled personnel for three main organizations. The first one is Arianespace, which is our commercial company, which is responsible for the launch operations and operating the Ariane launch site. To understand what are doing each of those three organizations, just imagine the Guyana Space Center like an airport. Arianespace will be the pilot of the aircraft. As the commercial operator, the Ariane launch system, Arianespace is responsible, as I said, for placing its customer satellite payloads into orbit, like a pilot is supposed to fly with the passenger and to bring them where they want to go. And the company markets Ariane launch services, acquires the Ariane launch vehicle, and handles all relations with customers. A company buys the aircraft and so on, and looks for the passengers. At the spaceport, Arianespace manages the industrial team that integrates and prepares the Ariane for launch, and the company oversees the satellite campaign from the spacecraft arrival through its injection into orbit. The second actor is the European Space Agency, which is, if we go on the comparison, which is the entity which defined and developed the aircraft. So it could be, normally it's the state who do that, and the state procures the aircraft to Boeing or to ISDC in Europe. So the European Space Agency is exactly the same. They define and develop the aircraft. ESA is the design authority for Ariane launchers. It developed the spaceport infrastructure, and the agency entrusts the commercialization, the production, and launch of Ariane vehicles to Arianespace, and delegates Ariane's direction and financial management to the French Space Agency, which the name is CNES, as a prime contractor. And CNES, of course, is the third organization. So if we go on the comparison of an airport, the CNES is responsible and provide the airport facilities, including safety and security. So the space agency, the French Space Agency, is the prime contractor, as I said, of the Guyana Space Center. And on site, CNES organizes all the support activities involving the campaigns that prepare Ariane launchers and the commercial satellite payload for liftoff from the spaceport. As I said, also France is also responsible for the launch safety. So the fire safety is ensured by the detachment of the Les Pompiers de Paris, the Paris Fire Brigade. The safety around the base is ensured by the French gendarmerie. It's like police, but it belongs to military forces, assisted by the 3rd Foreign Infantry Regiment of the French Foreign Legion. And before and during launch windows, France's security is significantly enhanced by anti-personnel and anti-aircraft measures. And all entrance to the launch complex is also subject to checks for proof of permission to enter the facility. Of course, we need more than those 3 organizations. We need the industry. And on the site, there is 2 organizations grouping all the industry together. The first one is what the name is, Guyana Industrial Space Community. And the idea is that the group apply the same rules on site. That's the way to reach the success. And the main industry are providing the liquid oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen plants, and so on, and also the ISDC space transportation, which is in charge of the booster storage building and the integration of the booster and the launcher. And beyond that, there is a second group, which is the Union of Industries of the Launch Bays, which oblige the incoming players, not those who are on the site, to apply the same regulation. So, as we see, the 3 organizations each of the 3 organizations need the other one to work. There is a lot of confidence, and the regulation, the rules are defined above all. That's, I think so, why it's working. And that's all. And I'm sorry for the accent.
As Kirby mentioned at the beginning, we do have a few moments for questions. If there are any questions, there are microphones, I believe, here in the aisle. So I see one person approaching. So,
Hi, I have this is Keith Cowling, NASAWatch.com. I have a comment for Lynn Cline, and I'm sure she's smiling back there. For the better part of 2 decades, anytime I'd get behind a microphone, either she'd be quivering or saying, "Oh my God, what's he going to ask my boss?" We're in a room of activists here, and I guess, the comment I want to make is, I'm willing to bet most people in here never heard of Lynn until she got up there and probably still don't know what she did. And when she left NASA, a lot of folks said, "What did she do?" And I said, "Well, wait about a month and a half." And indeed, about a month and a half after she left, people would say, "You know what, things aren't working anymore." And to me, that's the consummate comment. And for a bomb thrower like myself here, when you're in a group of activists like here, I often see the awards and the praise being given to NASA people who stand up and wave their arms around or do stuff and so forth. And yet, at the end of the day, those people who wave their arms around go back to their office, and Lynn's sitting there saying, now what do I have to do what you just promised that we were going to do? And oftentimes, this organization will give awards to people who do the arm waving or did something 30 years ago. And I would just like to say that, you really ought to be stopping to think that this agency has gone for decades with a lot of people you'll never, ever hear of. And if you don't give Lynn an award, you ought to come up with an award, which would be the Lynn Cline Unsung Hero Award or something like that. I just needed to say this. I think it's something that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you would never know about. And I would urge you to stop her from leaving the room and just have her give you more examples. And there are things she can't talk about, I can't talk about, that I know she did, and she really should be applauded for doing so.
thank you for that comment.
Good morning. Given the importance of delivering power safely to the front lines of our troops all over the world, how important is space solar power to the DoD, and would you entertain cooperation with other nations to put a space solar power satellite into orbit?
Yeah, so one of the great things about, I don't know if it's just being Sarah Factor or not, is that I totally know the limits of my expertise, and space solar power is going to be one of those. There's actually an expert wandering around here. I'm going to call him out. His name is Pete Gerritsen, who recently published on space solar power and kind of where that's going. I will tell you that it is something that we are exploring. It is not something that we are like building satellites for right now, quite frankly. I mean, it's, I think there's probably still a lot of policy implication and technical stuff that needs to be worked through. As far as would we consider cooperation, I'd be hard-pressed to think that there's an actual capability out there that supports, quite frankly, our warfighters and the larger government that we wouldn't be open to at least exploring the opportunities for international cooperation on, as long as we have a kind of a technical base that we, and a feasibility and a desirability that that's some place that we want to go in the future. So that was probably a terribly inadequate answer for you. But there are awesome experts around here that can talk much more confidently about the progress that we're making on space solar power and the technical kind of issues on that.
Okay, very good, thanks.
At the back, Mike?
Yes, this question is addressed to anyone on the panel who might have an insight into the answer. As many in this room know, large segments of the space community, particularly including National Space Society, are opposed to the Moon Treaty on the grounds of its, shall we say, hostility to non-governmental efforts to develop the Moon. Question is this: for those of that view, would we be better off letting sleeping dogs lie and not really getting into the Moon Treaty, or would it make more sense, given the political culture out there, to try to amend the Moon Treaty at this time?
Wow. You want to start since you're the COPUOS person?
Sounds like you're on now, Dave.
Okay. Now, it is not easy to do anything at COPUOS. That's my first answer. Because there have been many attempts. Okay, let me, what do I mean by that? You have to go back to 1959 when COPUOS was established. And I think there are about some 20-something countries that met at that time. Today, we have 71 countries. The larger you are, the more difficult it is to negotiate among yourselves. That's point number one. But point number two is the fact that all the earlier treaties that were put in place because they were mostly done by many countries that were space capable. Now, there are many countries today in COPUOS that are not space capable. I call them, they aspire to be in space, or they are on standby, and therefore the mutual understanding of what space entails is not there. Now, then there is the issue of who owns what. Now, I worked for the UN for 23 years, and every year we have 3 meetings. S&T in February, legal in March, and COPUOS in June. Out of my 23 years there, I attended the legal subcommittee once, and I promised never to return. And I have not returned. And what I'm saying is that I've asked many of the chairmen, what the hell are you doing? You know, because you are repeating the same thing, you are fighting among yourselves, and you are not really getting us anywhere. And that is what is going to happen to your request about revisiting the Moon Treaty at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll expand a little bit on that.
yes.
Having led the U.S. delegation to COPUOS for a number of years, if we really want to move forward with some kind of a change to the treaty, then I think the approach to it should be modeled on the kind of thing that we did with space debris in particular, where bringing the question of what do we do collectively to help mitigate and prevent the growth of space debris, coming into the UN, the instant reaction of many of the political players there is let's take it to the legal subcommittee and regulate it. And the approach that the countries who had a strong interest in this took was let's not turn it into a treaty. Let's talk about what are best practices. Let's look at what the pragmatic things are to do. And we got together the countries who have the technical expertise and the primary interest in it, and then collectively came and proposed those things that we'd already agreed on among the active operational space agencies. We proposed that to the UN and asked for an endorsement of it. And again, legal subcommittee wanted to take it and they wanted to turn it into a treaty, and we said, no, we just need an endorsement. And it took probably 5 years to get to that point, but we wanted to have the flexibility so when new techniques came up, we could go get those applied and not be locked into something that required a major renegotiation of a treaty. And so a number of things that have succeeded because you had a coalition of countries with a common interest who came forward with the proposal on how to deal with it. So if you really do want to go try and do something in the UN, I would say build your alliance first and then take it there. If you go in there and try to amend it, then it's a free-for-all and probably an impasse.
Okay. Did you, let me ask you this. You mentioned get an endorsement. Is endorsement like an official action that they,
It was,
there's a record,
yes.
there's an endorsement as such?
It was an official vote in the General Assembly, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Steve Lead. I work for NASA Goddard. I've taken the NASA orbital debris mitigation or orbital debris class, and I've done some work on it. I'd like to ask what the prospects are for international cooperation for active orbital debris removal.
For removal? I think that there has been a lot of discussion about what are the techniques that could be used, but I think it's very informal and exploratory at this point. But I would say, coming back to first principles, it's very much a common interest and a common responsibility. So if we could come to an understanding of what one wants to do, it's a natural for international cooperation.
Yeah, from a Defense Department point of view, this is something that specifically a couple of programs are looking at. Specifically, there's a program out of DARPA that's kind of looking at this, and there's a couple of working groups that are really looking at active debris removal. How would that happen? There's obviously a lot of area that needs policy development. I think the technology is there. In many of these instances, space solar power probably being one, active debris removal probably being another. The technology, in some cases, has outpaced the policy development. And so now the question becomes, as that becomes a reality, as the technical feasibility of it becomes more tangible and we're faced with it, what are the policy constraints or frameworks that we can develop to address that in a responsible way on our own and in partnership with our industrial and our international partners. And I think that's where you'll find a lot of our activity right now is recognizing that there is a desire out there, both at a governmental level and at an industrial level, figuring out what kind of policies and procedures and frameworks can we do to reach out to that community and to also reframe how we're thinking about it. And so that's kind of where we are from the DoD point of view.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. For that point of view, from France and mainly Europe, the first point is that at the upstream of the technical development, we have voted a law which is in force since now 2 years, which oblige all country which is launching from the European spaceport or using European French spacecraft to forecast a way to manage the debris. That's for the future. But that law is in force now in France. And I guess there is also some regulation in the United States with respect to that and everything. That is upstream the technology. From a technological point of view, As you know, Europe got a barter element inside the International Space Station Cooperation. Till now, the barter element was we were obliged to provide it was our choice to provide 5 cargo whose name are ITV. For the future, we are going to discuss that very soon because we have the ministerial meeting by the end of the year at the European level, at the European Space Agency level. And the barter element proposed today by our NASA colleagues is to provide a service module for a capsule, the MPCV. But we have the first step from a French point of view, we have to convince our European colleagues not to go on that way and to provide, instead of a service module which is not, it is not for us an innovation, technological innovation, we would like to provide an active debris removal system in cooperation with all the European countries, and we will try to convince them, and if we succeed by the end of the year, we'll go back to NASA to try to change the barter element. That's where we are today.
Yes. I think the last questions are the ones that are lined up right now. So,
with the understanding that the same word sometimes means different things to different people, I'd like to ask you what precisely you think the word sustainable means as anything other than a buzzword.
Philippe?
Just, maybe I'm completely wrong, but for me it's to maintain the use of space operational for the sake of human being and humanity. And security, of course.
Can I just say ditto? That's probably not going to fly. So it's a great question, and it's one that, policymakers need to deal with a lot because words do mean different things to different people. So in the classic policy parlance, we'll say it depends. Space sustainability, when we go into something like UN COPUOS, the long-term space sustainability of the space environment, right, may mean something very different than an operator who has to fly a satellite. And so depending on the context in which we're using, there may be variances in that definition. The one common thread that we generally find is the ability to consistently be able to operate in a safe and responsible manner. And that's really the key underpin for us in most of our definitions.
I think it's interesting that part of the way this is evolved in the debates I've heard in COPUOS and other international sessions is that there's an exact consensus on this idea of being able to continue to do what we're doing now without losing that ability because of debris or inability to prevent currently operating satellites from interfering with each other. But there are 2 other layers to that onion. And the other layer is the ability to continue to innovate. That is, to continue to do different things, more things, to not get to a point where we have, perhaps through debris or through intentional or unintended interference, gotten to the point where people can't come up with new ways to use space in the future. The third piece that often complicates matters, especially at the broad international level, is that in some people's minds it also means a kind of freedom of access that's not foreclosed to those who have not yet gone to space but might eventually go to space. And so some of the people in the sustainability argument will say that it is a violation of sustainability if anything happens that prevents them from eventually being able to do the kinds of things that the current participants are doing. So that's why this is a kind of complicated discussion. Yes, Ade.
Right. I want to take a spin on that because if you are going to New York from Washington here and you take Highway 95 and you have 2 drivers with learner's permit on your left side and your right side, and you have been driving for 20, 30 years with your license renewed every year with no problem, you'll be afraid. And for me, just like you said, I'm not talking about those who are going to come, but I'm looking at those who have satellites there but have no capability to even understand their situation in space, situation awareness, what is happening to our satellites, except that they pay for the insurance. And therefore, if the satellite should be lost, then the insurance company will pay. Suppose the satellite itself breaks up or is interfered with by another satellite, who takes responsibility? And so this is a major issue. Unfortunately, the international community is not addressing this right now because, as you said, Mike, some countries will say it interferes with their freedom to have free access to space.
I'd like to take a very different tack just for a moment and look from my little idealized perspective of the future. What sustainability to me would mean that we go out and explore space in a way that isn't a lot of stops and starts. We go here, that's the end of that program, we go back and contemplate whether or not we want to explore something else. I would like to see us move out into the solar system and just keep going and not have a human exploration program that keeps coming to dead ends. That's what sustainability would be for me.
I have a couple of questions. One has to do with the role of the UN in refugee relief. And recently, the UN Spider program has used space assets to try and respond to the situations that occur after natural disasters. One of the things that Sarah mentioned was the technology outpacing, the policy. And there certainly is a possibility of using space-based solar power to also reach remote locations where there disasters have occurred. And it seems to me that that might be a worthwhile study program in anticipation of that technology developing. And that might be something that could be added to the UN Spider initiative. I don't know how we would go about that, but that's a suggestion. So if there's a way to respond to that, I would appreciate that. Maybe I can see you afterwards offline. The second issue is that of planetary defense. And it seems that there's a very, very meager resources being devoted to looking at the issues of asteroids and what we would do to them. And that could, if it happens, even though it may be a low probability event, it certainly could be an international disaster if a major city is wiped out, or if some calamity occurs in that. And what could be proposed to as an international initiative in space debris to strengthen what we're doing?
Okay, let me take a stab at that. First and foremost, the UN Spider started after I had left the UN, so I'm not familiar with what they're doing. But one thing I know, the UN does not have a satellite of its own. The facilities being used by Spider to execute its activities, those satellites are provided by member states. My recommendation, then again, I want to say when you're talking about helping the refugees, I wonder whether there aren't many other ways you can use space capabilities to support the needs of people in such a condition. But that said, I think to really expatiate on what you said and probably to get the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs to listen to you, my suggestion is that you might want to write to Professor Marslan Othman, who is the director of the office, and articulate your point of view and probably make some suggestions, and the office might look at it and respond back to you in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can get his contact information after the session.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much for being an attentive panel after a great gala yesterday and an early Saturday morning. I think you've seen that the challenge of cooperation is one that is substantial. The results and the opportunities for cooperation are substantial, and that however much we may struggle with the notion of sustainability and be inspired by a vision of a sustainable human presence in space, that there is a need for all of us to cooperate to make sure that the thrill, the excitement, the intellectual challenge that we have had in our generation of building a space age is continued and accelerated for those who pick up the torch from us and move forward. So whether you be a torch bearer or a torch receiver, I hope that you will make cooperation and sustainable behavior a part of your future with the space sector. Thank you very much.